Hi guys, this is Dr. Gonzalez here, and I'm going to walk you through the paper template for this class. So I'm giving you a template because it helps keep everything standardized when it comes to writing. In the past, I've not given a template, and I found that different sections of the paper were formatted in different ways, and it just ended up being a lot easier by giving a template here. So when you open the template up in Word, don't mess with any of the settings. I've tried to go through and make sure all of the settings for spacing, font size, all of those things are the way they should be. So the first thing you're going to see is the title page. What I'd like you to do is go in and give your project a title. Most people will do something like, is there an association between variable X and variable Y? They'll keep it really simple like that, and that's exactly what you need to do. Under student name, obviously, put your first name and your last name. You can get rid of this. You can double click on it and type on top. And then leave the University of Houston Clear Lake, my name, and the class there, and everything will be fine. So when you move to the next page, you're going to have your abstract. And most people wait until the end of their paper, and by the end I mean they've finished writing everything else before they write the abstract, because the abstract is a summary. It's a very short summary, but it's a summary of your entire paper. So it's one well-formed paragraph. It should have no indentation. I don't know why that got indented right there. It goes over your topic, your lit review, your hypothesis, your general methods, and your analysis technique that you're going to apply, plus a sentence or two about your potential conclusion and the implications of the project. So it's really short. It should not be longer than about 150 words. And as just an example, this paragraph right here has 80 words in it. And if you wanted to see how many words were in a paragraph, you would highlight the paragraph like that, and then in Microsoft Word, go to search and type in word count. And it's going to tell you right here what I have highlighted is 79 words. So I was right on with about 80. So I would put this part of your paper in after you've written everything else. So when you scroll down, you're going to start in the body of the paper. You're going to repeat your paper title right here. And then you're going to start your introduction. And per APA guidelines, you don't need a subheader because it's implied that the first thing that you're going into in a paper is the introduction. Now your introduction is going to have three major parts: the lit review, your research question, and your general hypothesis. So the literature review, you can go back and read about this. Thankfully, it is a short class, so we're writing just a proposal. You need to have about 10 articles based off those 5 we started with at the beginning. And I recommend you go back and read Baldwin chapter 2 from that book about writing your psychology research paper, because he's going to walk you through a lot of good things about a literature review. But by the time you're done with that review, I expect you to have about 10 to 12 references. They should be peer-reviewed articles. And keep in mind that you're going to have a reference for each data collection measure that you're using and your statistical software. Now you're going to use the funnel method, and that means we start with broad conceptual view of your research topic, and you drill down to your specific research question. You should be thinking ahead to your question when you're writing, and you should be citing your sources as you go. So each article that you use in your lit review needs an in-text citation, which is going to look like Baldwin right here. That's an in-text citation, and then it's going to have a corresponding reference in the reference section. So go back and read your APA style guide if you need help with that. But for your lit review, go back and review assignment number 1. Incorporate any changes that I asked you to make. If you decide to copy and paste directly, use the right button and go to this Keep Text Only. That helps preserve the format of the paper. Now remember that you're logically structuring this paper as you go, and your introduction is going to end with your research question. So you end this section with your research question, and then you introduce your hypothesis using generic language. And I have included in Canvas a PDF version of a fictitious paper that you can see and go back and look at. That should walk you through, and it's completely fictitious, right? I made it up. I mean, it's real references and such and a real proposal, but it's not anybody's in particular. Be wary of AI. I don't recommend using AI at any point during the writing process. That includes polishing off your paper. That also includes Grammarly. What I do recommend is that you use the Writing Center at UHCL. They are a wonderful resource. They can help you from start to finish. Okay? Once you've drilled down to your research question and your hypothesis, you're going to move into your methodology. And the first thing you're going to do is address your study design. Now, this first paragraph right here just gives you some information about the methodology section, but you're going to start the section off by stating your research question again. Then you're going to tell me what type of non-experimental study you're proposing and your rationale. So if you're doing survey research, tell me why that was an appropriate method. If you're doing observational research, tell me why that was appropriate. Whatever the case is with your methodology, you need to describe it using the definitions and terminology that we've discussed in class or that Moreland goes over in her book. From that point, we move into our variables and operational definitions. You should have at least 3 paragraphs for this. What you're going to do is you're going to introduce your dependent variable, which is the measured variable. You're going to start first, though, with your independent variable. You're going to give me the concept and the conceptual definition, and this should come from one of your assignments that you've already done. And then you're going to give me the operational definition for it. And remember that operational definition is super important, okay, because that's how you're measuring or defining things. And then I want you to justify why you included that variable, and you can go back and look at my example paper for information. You'll do the same thing for your dependent variable. Start a new paragraph, give me the conceptual definition, list it as a concept, then follow it by the conceptual and then operational definition and justify it. Then in your third paragraph, I want you to write about any control variables that you feel like you need to address. For each one, describe that variable and describe how it might influence your study. So in other words, justify why it needs to be controlled, and you can again look at the example paper for more information. From there, we move into the hypotheses. In this section, you're going to write your null and your alternative hypothesis, and you're going to put them right here, and this is formatted specially so that everything is bumped over a ½ inch. Now, immediately following that, I want you to explain your hypotheses. And by that, I mean tell me what the null is and when you're going to reject it. Tell me what your alternative is and tell me when you are going to reject the null and adopt that alternative. So if you need help, go back and look at the example paper, and this information should come from one of your assignments that you've previously done. So make sure you have incorporated any feedback that I left for you. From there, we move into participants and sampling. In that section, I want you to describe your population, your participants, and the sampling technique that you're using. In your assignment, you proposed 2, I believe, possible techniques. You only need 1 for the paper. So just make sure whatever technique you pick, stick with that one and elaborate on it. So you should have at least 2 paragraphs there, 1 for your population and then 1 for your participants and sampling techniques. From there, you're going to move into your measurement tools. And in this section, you're going to need to tell me, probably in about 2 paragraphs, what tools you plan on using to collect data. One of those needs to be that measure that we identified in the measures assignment. And some of you identified 2 measures, and that's okay. If you look at my example paper, I'm looking at sleep chronotype and attitudes toward infidelity. So I needed a measurement for both of those. You'll also give me a paragraph where you're going to address what demographics or descriptive information that you might collect. And you can include writing about that by basing it off of that demographic survey that you wrote for me in class. So this should be information that was covered in, I believe, assignment 3. Also reference back to the paper that I have, the example paper, so you can see exactly what I'm talking about here. From there, we move into validity, and you're going to address 3 types of validity: external, statistical, and construct. We're leaving out internal validity because internal validity is usually most focused on a cause and effect relationship, and we are not addressing a cause or effect relationship in this paper because it's non-experimental, and all of your questions should be leading towards a correlational design. Now, you might want to go in and recognize that your tools have been validated for internal validity, and you could do that under the measurement section, and that would be fine. But you should have 3 detailed paragraphs, and each one of those paragraphs should address validity. 1 for external, 1 for statistical, and 1 for construct. Then you're going to move into the procedure. Now, this is going to be a portion of the paper that you haven't written through your assignments. But what you're going to do is describe in detail each step of the project, starting with IRB. You can have as many paragraphs as you want, but you need to cover these essential topics that are in here. You need to talk about IRB review, and mainly what you need to do is tell me that you're going to fill out the application and get IRB review before you start collecting data. You'd also talk about your informed consent process, making sure that they get a copy. Then you talk about your data collection procedures, and there is where you get really, really explicit. You're going to tell me exactly what your participants are going to do, step by step, and I'll show you the example paper in a moment. Make sure you mention that you're going to maintain confidentiality and anonymity, and that you're going to protect your data somehow. And this is where you really get a place to shine, and tell me exactly how you would carry out this research. When you're finished with that portion, we move into the analytic plan, and this is also a portion that is going to be new. I ask you to remember that you're not collecting data. This is not an actual research project that we're doing, so you're not going to have any results to report. What you're going to do, though, is describe the statistical techniques you use to describe both your sample and to test your hypothesis. So you're going to tell me what descriptives you would run, how you plan to describe that sample, and then what you need in order to go into the measures of frequency, central tendency, and variability that would be needed to describe your sample. Then you move into your inferential statistics. Most of you guys will be doing a Pearson's correlation. And if you're unsure about whether or not that's the appropriate statistic for your research question, please reach out to me, okay? Make sure you tell me if you're doing a one-tailed or a two-tailed hypothesis, and tell me under what circumstances you would reject or fail to reject your null, okay? You can either reject it or you can fail to reject it, and that's going to be based off your p-value. Your p-value is, again, based off of your Pearson's R, okay? From there, we move into our discussion. Again, we're not collecting any data, so you're not going to have any results to interpret. But you should discuss it like if it had produced results. Either they can support or they can not support your hypotheses. Tell me what you would do in each one of those situations. Tell me what that might mean. You can also tie this back to your literature review. So use existing empirical studies in your interpretation, acknowledge the limitations of your study, Tell me what you could do better in the future. What are the limitations? What would you modify? Briefly, tell me how you could follow this up. Most of the time, the next logical step is an experiment. So tell me about that. In this portion of the paper, you should have about 4 to 5 short paragraphs, and you can follow the instruction for the discussion in an empirical paper, and you can look at the example that I have made for you so that you can see what I'm talking about. From there, you go into your references. Please delete these references. These are simply here as placeholders, and they're also examples of the way you should do an APA citation. I will be grading this in particularly kind of heavy. So there's a huge portion of our class that should have been dedicated to this during that first week. I expect you by this point in time to be able to craft a reference that is correct. Now, that is your template. I will upload that into Canvas. Let's look at a sample research paper. And there's one mistake in this paper. I did not make the abstract, so I apologize. But this fictitious paper was exploring the relationships between sleep chronotype and attitudes toward infidelity in college professors. And this is just an example, right? Told you I accidentally forgot to write the abstract, so just ignore that part. You'll notice I put the same title as the paper, the title page right here. I don't have an introduction header because it's assumed. I start this paper out by talking about what infidelity is. I cite some studies that have defined it, and I've set the tone for how infidelity is important to study. So I transition from there into how attitudes and infidelity change in different populations, how it's judged in different populations, how in different settings it's certain things are considered to be infidelity, certain things aren't. And I basically paint a picture for all of these different variables that have been linked to how people evaluate infidelity, because that's what I'm having my people do in this study. They're going to evaluate their attitudes towards infidelity. What I'm trying to do is associate it with sleep chronotype. So I'm going to go underneath here and I explain what sleep chronotype is. I tell my reader that it refers to whether a person functions better earlier in the day, later, or somewhere in between. I also talk about some of the things that have already been associated in the previous research to various sleep chronotypes. For example, how well you sleep, your mood, rumination, and depression have all been linked to sleep chronotype. Mood-related difficulties right there, that's been associated with eveningness. So night owls like myself tend to be worse sleepers. They sleep, they take longer to fall asleep, and in general, they're more vulnerable to getting bouts of depression and anxiety. So I then drill down a little further. What I've done now is I've talked about what infidelity is. I've talked about what sleep chronotype is. So now I want to push this together and tell why my study is important. So I tell my reader that there is a possible connection between chronotype and relationship attitudes. And if there is this relationship here, it could affect how people view infidelity. And I'm also going to highlight how there has not been any research done on this. There actually has not been any research done on this at all. So this is actually a research project that we could carry out. I tell my reader that there's a gap in the literature, right? And then I talk about how my present study addresses this particular research question. You introduce your research question, and then you introduce your general hypothesis using words. So I said, based on the previous literature, I hypothesize that there is a correlation between sleep chronotype and attitude towards infidelity in professors. And really what I would like to say here is that I believe that people who are an evening chronotype are probably going to be more open to infidelity, because there is an actual precedent for that with regard to night owls. So moving on from there, I go into my methodology section. I introduce my study design by repeating my research question again. I then say it's an experimental correlational design. I explain why that's true, because I'm not manipulating anything. I'm not assigning people to groups. I'm going to measure these variables as they naturally occur, and that's the definition of a non-experiment. I then talk about a survey method. That is the most appropriate. I can't do this through observations. I again tell what chronotype and infidelity are. Those are my variables that I've identified, and a survey is best for collecting data about those variables. It's also cross-sectional because that means I'm going in and taking a snapshot of data at one point in time. And most of you guys will also have a cross-sectional design. I don't recall anybody giving me an example that was longitudinal. If you're in doubt, ask me and I'll help you without a problem. So I repeat the purpose of the study. It's to determine whether sleep chronotype and attitudes towards infidelity are associated at one point in time, not over time. And I'm going to emphasize that this is non-experimental. I can come up with an association, but I cannot show causality. From there, I move into my operational definitions. You should have three good paragraphs here. You're going to introduce your independent variable. Make sure you mention it is non-manipulated. I conceptually define it. Then I define it by my measure. I'm going to use a measure to define it. So they're going to take this measure and it's going to tell them if they're morning, evening, or intermediate. Then I define what chronotype is, and I show the questionnaire that I'm using for that. Okay, then I move on and talk about my dependent variable. In this situation, the dependent variable is attitudes towards infidelity. I define it conceptually, and I tell why those are important, right? Then I operationally define it. I'm using the attitudes toward infidelity scale. I explain that it's a Likert type scale that measures how accepting or approving participants are of infidelity related behaviors. Higher the score, more accepting attitude. Lower score, less accepting attitude. And I'm citing this as I go along. Whatley 2008, that's where the attitudes towards infidelity scale came from. And I justify the inclusion of that variable because the purpose of the study is to explore infidelity and sleep chronotypes. I then go down here and I talk about some variables that I need to control for. There are several that I have decided on. Gender is one of those. And what that means is that in my analysis, I'm going to probably split my analysis by gender, because in previous research, there has been a difference in attitudes towards infidelity between men and women. And that's important to know. It does not mean that I'm not going to analyze this from a general perspective with men and women together. It just means I'm going to be aware of how gender has played a role in other studies, and I'm going to be aware of that when I run my data. I'm also going to look at age, because attitudes toward relationships and infidelity may change over time. Again, I'm not going to eliminate anyone as long as they are an adult, because I want to get the best picture I can of my data, but I also want to be aware that I might need to look at how age plays a factor in here, because it could affect my interpretation of the results. I'm also going to look at relationship status, and I believe I include a prior experience with infidelity as well. So that would just mean that in my demographic questionnaire, I would include a question about whether or not the person has been affected by infidelity, or whether or not they have participated as an extramarital partner or extra relationship partner. I end my variable section by just talking about how those control variables will help me do a better analysis. From there, I transition to hypotheses. My hypotheses for this are going to be two-tailed because I don't have anything from the literature that's pushing me towards one end or the other of attitudes. I start the section off by repeating my research question again. Then I list my null. I would say there's no statistically different association or relationship between the two variables. And then my alternative is that there is a statistically significant association between the two variables. Then in a paragraph underneath here, I just explain what I wrote up here. My null says there's no relationship. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're a morning or evening person. It doesn't have any relationship to how accepting or unaccepting you are with infidelity-related behaviors. Your alternative hypothesis says that they are related. This is an experimental study and it's correlational, so I'm focusing on association. If my alternative is supported, results would suggest that there is a relationship, but they would not show causality. So I'm going to highlight that particular statement because I just need to emphasize multiple times that this is not a causation scenario because this is a non-experimental research study. From there, I go into my participants and sampling. So I asked you in your sampling assignment first to talk about your population. So for this study, I'm using college professors in public and private colleges and universities in Texas. They can be part-time, they can be full-time, they can teach graduate or undergraduate, they can be at a community college or a research university. It doesn't matter. I want to get a sample that's going to consist of those college professors, and they're going to voluntarily participate. To answer that online survey, they need to be at least 18 years old and currently employed as an instructor, a lecturer, a professor, adjunct faculty, or tenure-track faculty at a Texas institution of higher learning. Okay. College professors are appropriate because they have interesting work schedules, interesting grading responsibilities. They've got a lot of stuff on their plate, and I'm curious about how they sleep. Right? So I'm going to use stratified purposive sampling. I'm going to group my colleges and universities into categories, and then I'm going to identify a faculty email directory, and I'm going to email those people, and I'm going to invite them to participate, and from there it becomes voluntary. I justified this by saying this is appropriate because I'm intentionally targeting a specific population. And by using stratification here, I want to improve the diversity of my sample from many different environments. It's not going to give me a random sample, but it's going to give me a practical, realistic, and appropriate sample. Then I'm going to move into my measurement tools. For my particular study, I do have two of them. I talk about the morningness, eveningness questionnaire, and I cite it, okay? And I explain what that questionnaire asks. I talk about the items, and I talk about the scores. The scores are going to end up being used to classify them as morning or evening people. The higher the score, the greater the morningness of the person. And what that does is that allows me to classify my participants by sleep chronotype. Then from there, I move into the second portion, which is the measurement of my dependent variable. I want to use the Attitudes Towards Infidelity scale by Whatley, and it's a self-report measure. It looks at participants' beliefs about the acceptability of infidelity-related behaviors using a Likert scale. And it asks the participants to indicate their level of agreement. And they also tell me whether or not certain things are harmful or whether a person might be justified under certain circumstances. So the higher the score, the more accepting the person is of infidelity, The lower the score, the less accepting they are. And that's an appropriate measure because it's getting at infidelity, which is my dependent variable. And then I'm going to transition and talk about my shorter demographic and descriptive survey. I'm going to tell what kind of variables demographic wise I'm going to collect. I need age, gender, relationship status, faculty rank or role, their institution, years of teaching. I might include an open-ended question. I would also ask them there if they have been unfaithful or have had a partner that was unfaithful, because those are possible control variables I already discussed, right? Then I move into validity. In this particular research paper, you need to address 3 kinds of validity: your external, your construct, and your statistical validity. So remember, external is the ability to generalize to a specific from that specific sample to a larger population. Okay, I'm going to tell what that validity is, and then I'm going to talk about the threats to them and how I would address them. In this section, I caution you, go back and read the feedback that I gave you on your assignment about validity. Some of you received a significant amount of feedback. You need to make sure that you incorporate it. You'll notice that this paragraph right here, I'm going to zoom out so you can see, this is one paragraph about external validity. You cannot address external validity in 2 sentences. You need to write a nice paragraph that defines it, tells me the threats, and then addresses them. You're going to do that for external validity. You're going to do that for statistical validity. And you're going to do that for construct validity. And you could go back and read my example here to see all of the ways you can write about these validity concepts. I talk about using a poorly written measure of chronotype or a poorly written measure for infidelity. All that's related to my construct validity. You can go back and read that on your own. I'm not going to bore you with it in this video. Then I move into the procedure. This is going to be a new section for you to write. We haven't done anything with procedure yet, but I'm going to start by talking about getting IRB approval, because I need IRB approval before I can begin to collect any data. I talk about how I expect this to be of minimal risk, but I still need to get IRB review. After I get that review, I talk about recruitment. Now, I've already talked about how I'm going to sample, so I don't need to go and overlap those details here. I just need to say, hey, this is what I'm going to start doing. All right. I'm going to also mention that when I'm recruiting, I'm going to tell my participants that their participation is voluntary, anonymous, and limited to adults. This is where you start talking about your procedures step by step. And I talked about how once they get that recruitment email, it has a link to the online survey. So they're able to consent and start right then. It takes them to an informed consent page. They read that. They talk about the benefits and the risks. They can stop, withdraw, all that stuff. And they have a right to a copy of that consent form, and they can also print that out before they continue. If they don't agree to consent, they exit the survey and they go on about their life. If they do consent, they go straight into the survey questions, talk about how they answered the demographic and descriptive questionnaire first. I give a little explanation about it. I don't have to list all the variables there, just a little bit. And then I talk about how I'm going to use that. Then I move into the morningness, eveningness questionnaire. And then I move to the attitudes towards infidelity. So just the same way that they would be answering those measures and tools if I were actually giving them right now. And then I talk about how when they're finished here, the participants' responses come up with a total score. And higher scores are more accepting, lower scores are less accepting. And I said the same thing up here for chronotype score. Then I say at the end of it, they get a debriefing page, just thanking them for their participation. There was no deception, but we still use a debriefing page to just kind of thank our participants. I talk about, again, that we're not going to share their data. It's just, you can be creative and talk about this. This is a great example for you to follow, but it doesn't have to be exactly like this. I also talk about confidentiality and anonymity, and I talk about how I'm going to store my data. Okay. From there, I move into the analytic plan. This is also new. You have not done this part yet. I talk about how this is a proposed study, so there's no actual data at this time, but I talk about how my descriptives would be used to summarize first. Then I talk about how central tendency and variability would be used to describe stuff, because that's what descriptive statistics do. They paint a picture of your participants. I want to focus on my mean and standard deviation too, because those things help me find any general pattern of scores before I start with my hypothesis testing. So you can go back and you can read this information about how I would use it. This is a great example for how your data analysis plan would be written. Eventually, you're going to get to the hypothesis testing, and you're going to talk about using your Pearson's correlation coefficient. You're going to explain what a positive correlation would mean. You're going to explain what a negative correlation would mean. You would also explain what a correlation near zero would mean. That would mean there was no association, either positive or negative, between those variables. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into the statistics portion of the course, which is why you won't be writing this portion until towards the end of the class. I go into more detail about what the Pearson's R is, how it's calculated, and how I'm going to make a decision about my hypotheses based off of that result. Then you're going to go into a discussion. In the discussion portion, you're going to tell me what happens if your results support your hypothesis, and tell me what would happen if your results don't support your alternative hypothesis. I'm going to mention that I'm adding to the existing literature because this hasn't been studied before. It also gives me more information about sleep functioning and daily functioning. I talked about how you relate this back towards the literature, and I'm going to mention again here how my prior research has found that there are differences in attitudes toward infidelity, and that those things are associated with relationship quality. So there's a lot of different variables here that have already been shown to be associated. So if I can link chronotype to it, it would also help in the way that we study romantic relationships and the associations between those things in this particular population. So I also talk about how this might suggest a difference, and that's also based on my prior literature. So you're going to have to go back and read your literature review and see what was said in the past and kind of relate what you're getting back to how your results would help boost what's been done in the past. I talk about what would happen if my results don't support the hypothesis. So you have to kind of think about it outside the box, inside the box. I've talked about a lot of different things here. I'm not going to read it for you. You can go back and read it yourself. It's a great example of how you can write your analysis for each section, right? How it supports, how it doesn't support. From there, I transition into limitations. One of the things that you obviously need to mention is that this is a non-experimental cross-sectional survey design. It's not an experiment. And the only way that we can prove a causal relationship would be to manipulate a variable and do an experiment. I also mentioned to use self-reported measures. People might not like to talk about these things too, because infidelity is kind of a sensitive topic. So, some people might only respond in the way they think is socially desirable. And I also talked about how the sample might limit generalization. I'm going to try to get all of the professors I can, but just because I got professors, I might not even be able to generalize this to adults in other occupational groups. And then the last portion, I talk about what kind of follow-ups could be used. So we could talk about how sleep quality, rumination, stress, and satisfaction, how those things might explain that difference. I could also say that future hypotheses might suggest that X, Y, and Z need to be looked at. From there, you'd go into your references page. Remember, your references need to be double spaced, have a 1/2 inch hanging indent. You put spaces between your initials. Make sure your journal articles are capitalized like a sentence. And by that, I mean you capitalize the first word and you put a period and you capitalize anything that comes after a punctuation mark. But I don't capitalize infidelity or vignette or norms or any of that. I do capitalize the journal title and I put it in italics. I put a comma and I put the volume in italics as well. Include your DOIs because I might want to go back and read some of your articles. Make sure they're in alphabetical order as well. If they appear down here, there must be an in-text citation for that article, and vice versa. If there is an in-text citation, it needs to be listed in your references. So that's a basic rundown. This paper will be in Canvas. The template will be in Canvas. And this video will be there. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And don't forget that the UHCL Writing Center is an excellent resource for helping you write your paper.